We grew up visiting my grandparents every summer. The kid in me called where they lived the swampy area of South Carolina. I never did mind the trip down south as a kid, but I can't say the same about my dad. My dad had an interesting relationship with his parents. He didn't care to elaborate when I was in the room, but there were definitely some conversations with him and Mom that happened after I went to sleep. But anyway, being the Southern gentleman that he was, my dad made sure that we made the trip out at least once a year to see the family. My grandfather was a big outdoorsman. He and my grandma lived in a comfortable but modest little place nestled in the woods, surrounding a large swamp. My grandpa liked to take me fishing out at the swamp whenever he had the chance, but that always troubled my dad. Now, each summer when we arrived and I was a year older, it was obvious that my grandparents were aging too. This was something that was actually lost on me when I was younger, but my dad could see it clear as day. So as vague as his issues were with them, he knew the truth about time in a way that I did not. That's why he kept bringing us to see them every year. Some adults are good about that, hiding emotions to ultimately do the right thing. When we arrived one summer, Grandma was sick. She had been for a few months, but now was the first that Dad was hearing about it. It's hard to say if he was angry, scared, or maybe both. I didn't understand it like he did. But that was enough for us to extend our trip from a week to a month. It was also long enough for him to keep his eyes trained on me and Grandpa, like a hawk. I was thrilled when Dad wanted to come out fishing with us one day. He often used the excuse that he had too much work, or that Mom needed him around, or just about anything else under the sun, to be honest. But nonetheless, halfway through our stay, something inside him changed his mind. On that particular day, the sun was shining bright and hard through the tree cover of the forest. I had gotten used to the heat and humidity of South Carolina summers by then, so the sweat wasn't too big of an issue. But gosh, that swamp was buggy. Cicadas, toad bugs, beetles, biting flies, you name it. Grandpa always had us dress in long sleeves and long pants despite the temperature. He was against the use of bug spray, too. Regardless of all of this, I was just so excited to have my two old men out there with me. We never went fishing all together, so this was a real treat. Dad was quiet at first. He hadn't really spoken much on the short little trek out to the swamp. He basically stayed mute amongst the joyous, boisterous laughing of me and Grandpa. Grandpa said that Dad was generally uninterested in fishing when he was growing up here, and that he'd always wished for a kid like me to come along and enjoy nature with him. Well, when Dad heard him say that, he wasn't quiet anymore. In fact, he was really quick to jump in and defend himself. It wasn't the fishing, he said, but the swamp that he hated. And then it was Grandpa who was speechless. We had finally reached the fishing spot and spirits were low. I tried my best to keep things light for everybody's sake, but I knew that they had to work it out by themselves. Then the sun hitched in the sky and began its slow descent from late afternoon. I realized that no one had said anything in over an hour, and worse, no one had caught any fish. That was what flipped my switch, and I suddenly burst out at the two of them. I said that it wasn't fair to me for them to ruin our day like this. And though I was no scientist and I couldn't say for sure, I was pretty confident the negativity was deterring the fish. My dad actually laughed. I was mad at him, though. Why was he laughing? I said that the day might have been better if he had just stayed home. As soon as I said that, though, I wished I hadn't. My dad's face fell, and when I looked to Grandpa for reassurance, his had fallen too. Before I could take it back, my dad excused himself, picking up his fishing gear, and he started back home. I tried to go after him, but Grandpa held my arm. He told me that he needed to fix this, not me, and that I should stay back until sunset. Hopefully, I'd have a fish by then, and with that, Grandpa left to follow Dad. Now I was alone by the swamp. I loved it out there, though, so normally I wouldn't mind the time alone. But with everything that had been said just moments ago when the three of us were together, it made everything feel strange. It was like somebody had paused the previous scene, plucked Dad and Grandpa out and allowed the film to play out as if nothing had happened. But I listened to what Grandpa had said, so I put on a smile and felt determined to bring home a catch. My focus was on the swamp for a second before I saw something move in my peripheral vision. I thought it must have been Dad or Grandpa, but when I fixed my gaze at the moving figure, I could not have been more wrong. What I saw was a giant, mud-packed creature sulking behind a bush. Under the mud was a slimy layer of greenish-brown scales that coated the creature's huge, 8-foot-tall body. It was like a giant lizard, but it crouched on 2 feet, giving it some type of human resemblance. I didn't know what to think, or even where to start. My eyes were everywhere, taking this thing in with wonder. But its eyes, yellow and shining with unfiltered rage, terrified me. It was looking at me like I was a fish on a line, and my composure was how it reeled me in. It had been waiting to get me alone. For how long, though? Days? Weeks? Years? I didn't know. The longer I stayed still, the longer it had to plan its attack. I wriggled involuntarily. Maybe the fish metaphor had struck me a little too close. And then the thing shifted. I did not think after that. I just ran. I forgot about my pole and all the gear that belonged to Grandpa, and I sprinted through the marshy plants towards home. I could hear the thing pursuing me, gaining on me, preparing for me. But I could see the house just beyond the forest, and my feet just flew. I flung myself through the front door, panting and sweating, but I was pleased with what I saw. Dad and Grandpa sitting together at the kitchen table, talking. They had fixed it. When they saw my face, though, their calmness vanished. I didn't want to tell them what really happened, but I did suggest that from now on, maybe the 3 of us could find a new place to fish, a place where we all felt comfortable, where we could all be together and actually enjoy the outdoors. Before I became a teacher, I had a short-lived career as a park ranger. I'd grown up in a heavily forested area, and I had been an avid hiker and camper, so it seemed like it would be a fun and easy job. After college, I got hired by the National Park Service, and I had a brief placement in Utah before being relocated to Tennessee, specifically the Great Smoky Mountains. I was really looking forward to spending a summer there. Instead, I got a summer of hell. It started well enough. As a newbie, I was doing a lot of patrolling and routine safety checks. That was fine by me. I got to roam around the gigantic park, sometimes going hours without seeing anyone. And then a few weeks into the job, I got this first weird call. The family had called in and reported animal tracks all around their site. It wasn't a big deal. All parks have some wildlife. But when I got there, I was sure one of the other rangers was messing with me. Like I thought that it was a hazing kind of a thing. There were tracks, but they were really weird. They definitely weren't canine or bear. They were humanish in shape, but huge, and with claws on the ends. I checked out the area, took some pictures, and then helped the family get another campsite, because obviously they were feeling uncomfortable. I turned the pictures in to my boss, expecting her to laugh and give up the joke. Instead, she was pissed. She thought I was the one playing a joke. I asked her to come out to the site with me, and amazingly, she agreed. But by the time we got there, it was the next day, and the rain that fell overnight had washed away the prints. 2 weeks later, I got another call, and this one was worse. The campsite was completely trashed. The tents were shredded and everything was destroyed. Luckily, the campers hadn't been there at the time, but they'd returned after a hike to total devastation. This camp was in a grassy area, so there weren't any footprints, but I did find some light brown tufts of fur on the ground. This time, my boss saw the destruction herself, but she marked it as a bear attack. A hungry bear looking for food, she said. But the fur didn't look anything like a bear's. Also, whatever had made the attack had gone after everything, even areas where there weren't any food. It was bizarre. It just didn't add up. And then, the final episode happened in early August. I say final because I couldn't deal after that. I got a call about a lost pet, The young couple had been walking their dog and it had slipped out of its collar and taken off into the woods. The couple was devastated, so I and a few of the other new rangers got picked to head into the woods to try to find the dog. We broke off into pairs, knowing that going too far off trail was dangerous. I was with Brian, a decent guy I had sort of become friends with the past few months. We walked for hours, doing our best to cover our area. We whistled and called, but we didn't see any sign of the dog. And then there were 2 hours of daylight left, and we hadn't gotten any other pressing calls, so we agreed to stay out looking for those 2 hours before going back to the parking lot. As the sun started setting, we turned around and made a beeline for the nearest trail. We still had maybe 20 minutes or so until we got there, and then 15 minutes on the trail itself. I felt bad about not finding the dog, but there was nothing else we could do. Halfway to the trail, we started hearing noises, growling noises, a low howl. The missing lab was a dog, so it was sort of promising, but they didn't sound like that. So we were alarmed and grabbed our bear spray, although it sounded more like a wolf. It was almost dusk, so inside the forest it was getting difficult to see. We looked around, but we couldn't identify the source of the sounds. So we just kept walking and hoping to leave whatever it was behind. And then at the same time, Brian and I noticed the tree. It looked like it had been mauled, huge scratch marks and missing branches, not unlike what a bear would do. I pulled out my flashlight and I looked around the base of the tree. There were footprints, but they weren't a bear. Just like the ones I had seen months ago, they were huge and humanoid, but with claws at the end and narrower. This time, though, someone else saw them. Brian's eyes got huge, and he started swearing. We were suddenly very aware that we were alone in the forest, and it was nearly nighttime, and we were still very far away from help. We picked up our pace, going as quickly as we could in the twilight, but we kept hearing crushing and grunting sounds that kept moving. Twice I saw a dark shape run past, but the trees made it impossible to see exactly what it was. But it was large and tall, which was concerning. It wasn't low to the ground like a bear. We were nearly running as we approached the trail, or where we thought the trail was. We had to be within yards of it when the creature barreled out of the woods and crashed right into us. I had a glimpse of a dog-like face before it knocked me into Brian, and we went tumbling down the slope together. We rolled for seconds before hitting a tree. I grabbed a large branch for a weapon, and we limped out of the forest, bruised and sore. It was well past dark by the time we got to the parking lot. The other rangers were waiting there for us, worried that we were so late. Under the lights, they could see that we were scraped up, and we explained what happened. But before they could even respond, I showed them a shallow claw mark on my shoulder where the creature had hit me. I told them that it was some kind of a wolf or a dog, but walking upright because I had no idea how else to describe it. And it was the truth anyway. Even though I had Brian backing me up, they didn't believe us. My boss was pissed at me again and threatened to reassign me, but instead, I quit. I had had enough of whatever the hell monster was roaming in those woods. Coincidentally, the poor couple never did find their dog. This next story takes place in 1975. I grew up on a farm in Tennessee surrounded by dense trees and vegetation. When I was little, we played outside on the farm and in the trees, but that all changed in the fall of '75. We were surrounded by cornfields getting ready for harvest. Corn stood 6 to 7 feet tall, and you could literally get lost in it. We sometimes did when playing hide and seek with my cousins. My sister and I had horses, and we loved to go riding. We would explore the woods and the cornfields. That day, we took the horses down a farm road around this grove of trees and got ready to race once we hit the corner. My sister was only around 10 years old, so I kept a good eye on her, but she could handle horses well. We got 2 posts away from the corner, and the horses cut loose. But as we went to turn, they stopped dead mid-lope and suddenly reared up, knocking us both off. I still hung onto the reins and quickly got up to help my sister. She grabbed her horse. It was backing away, throwing its head. Mine was acting the same way. I struggled to get my sister up on her horse and keeping control of mine as it turned in circles. As I turned in circles trying to calm the horse, I saw it. All I said was, "Get on your horse," and threw my sister onto her saddle. She started crying, terrified. I let her horse go so it shot back to the farm like a racehorse at the gate. Luckily, she was able to hold on and made it back to the barn safely. I struggled to get on mine as I couldn't take my eyes off the thing at the edge of the woods. It was huge and hid behind a cedar. I couldn't really see its eyes, but I know it was watching me. I finally got on my horse, absolutely terrified. I let my horse go and she shot off towards home. Dad was already coming out of the house as my sister was screaming, "There's something in the woods! There's something in the woods!" I wasn't faring much better, crying in terror. We were kids and freaking out as kids do. My sister was clinging to my dad. The horses were worked up and still wide-eyed and trying to get away. Dad told us to get them in the barn until they calmed. We ran back as Dad came out with a shotgun and said, "Show me where it's at." Being kids and under the impression that my dad was invincible, we did as we were told. It was terrifying, though, the thought of going back. So my little sister stayed with my mom. Dad drove the truck to where we saw it. My brother came too. But of course it was gone. Nothing. Dad and my brother went and investigated behind the tree, looking down and then towards the field. My dad stood 6'2" and the tree 10 feet, and that damn thing had to be at least 8 or 9 feet. They finally came back and told me it was my imagination, but I swear to God it was there and it was real. The next day, a couple of neighbor kids and I, armed with a shovel and an axe, searched those trees for the thing that had terrified us. We went to that tree. The heavy leaf cover was all messed up and I saw scratches on the tree. Dad later said it was just them scratching there, and I didn't argue. My dad was never a liar, ever. He passed away in 2018, and sometime after he died, my mom told my sister and I a story we couldn't believe. After we had seen whatever that creature was, a few weeks later my dad came home from playing cards with friends and neighbors in town. He parked in the garage, which wasn't connected to the house. As he was walking across the yard and he heard something he's never heard. It was low, growling sounds that were getting closer and closer. It stopped him dead in his tracks. As he looked around, he felt like it was mocking him, making the sounds, but he couldn't tell what direction they were coming from. He told my mom he felt a darkness and fear like he had never felt before. He didn't want to scare us any more than we already were, but my dad was scared, and he told my mom, "Don't let the kids go in the woods." He kept the shotgun out that night and never usually did that. We weren't allowed into the woods, which was hard to do because the farm was surrounded by them. I do remember one night that fall, the horses were crying and running in the horse pen. Dad went out with the shotgun, but I don't know what happened. My sister and I never did race the horses there ever again. There was something there. I swear on that. Thanks for listening. I've never told this story to anyone. I was scared to tell anybody until now. I was a college student studying abroad in a small village in the gorgeous mountains of Ireland. It was a beautiful, quaint little town with an old castle and a small market square where locals would gather to buy and sell their goods. The villagers were friendly, and I quickly made friends with a group of students who were also studying abroad. But things started to take a strange turn when we began to hear strange noises coming from the castle at night. It started with just a few whispers here and there, but soon the whispers turned into wails and screams. It freaked us out, and as foolish as it now sounds, we decided we had to go and check things out. I was a curious student with a love for adventure, still do love to be adventurous, but I've wisened up a little in my old age. I was always fascinated by the paranormal and the unexplained, and I saw this as an opportunity to investigate something that could potentially be supernatural. My friends were just as curious as I was, and we all agreed that we had to find out what was really happening in that castle. Our first sighting of something truly strange was when we all saw a shadowy figure passing by the windows. We were all terrified, but at the same time, it was absolutely thrilling. We were all into ghost shows and paranormal investigations and all that stuff. This was an opportunity to do the investigating ourselves. We were so excited. We decided to investigate the next day, but we found nothing out of the ordinary. Over the next few nights, we continued to hear strange noises coming from the castle, but we didn't see anything and we couldn't capture any evidence. It wasn't until one night when we were exploring the castle grounds that we found an old, hidden passage that led deep into the castle. We knew we had to explore it. As we made our way through the passage, we saw strange symbols and markings on the walls, and all of us felt uneasy, and I was nauseous. There was truly something unnerving about this passageway. And then we all heard strange whispers and voices that seemed to be coming from nowhere. It was horrifying, and a couple of my friends ran back screaming. They couldn't handle it, but the rest of us pushed on. And then we heard this loud, piercing scream that made us all scream in terror. We booked it out of there, screaming, crying, yelling. There was a door at the end of the passage that we almost made it to, but it was clear that something didn't want us in there. We all made it out without a hitch, and a few days later we met a local historian at a pub who told us that the castle had a dark history of witchcraft and the occult. He warned us to stay away, but we had already gotten so far, and we couldn't help wondering what could possibly be in that door. So the next night we made our way back down the passage, pretty much trembling and tiptoeing the whole way down. We opened up the door and it led us to a round room with an altar in the middle, with melted candles all over the place. There were old knives and swords and creepy symbols all over the walls, and a big pentagram was painted red on the floor. One of my friends had the idea to light the candles and then try to communicate with whatever forces were haunting the castle. In hindsight, we were asking for it, big time. But at the time, it was just part of an exciting adventure into the unknown, and we were all changed people when we returned from it. Anyway, we lit the candles and started asking stupid questions like, is anybody here? What do you want from us? Why haven't you moved on? None of us really knew what we were doing, but there was so much activity in that castle that we knew something was bound to happen. Just when we were about to call it quits because nothing was transpiring, all of the candles went out at once, and the door slammed shut. We piled over to the door, but we realized it was locked, and now we were panicked. We eventually lit the candles back up and tried to come up with some sort of a game plan to get the door back open. So then suddenly we noticed this thick, black, shadowy smoke that was swirling around the room. The smoke got denser and denser, and eventually formed into a figure above the altar. The figure let out this deep, horrible growl that I could only describe as demonic, and it seemed to be coming from multiple sources, and it got louder and louder. Finally, one of my friends kicked the door down, and we all clambered out of there and never went back. None of us slept that night, and we sat around profusely researching everything we could find about that castle. We eventually found out that the castle had a long history of occult witchcraft, and there was supposedly a shadow demon that had been summoned by witches to do their bidding. I cannot stress enough how lucky I feel that we all are to be alive after that encounter with the shadow demon. It was an experience that changed our lives forever. Looking back, we were so foolish to even attempt to investigate the paranormal without any proper knowledge or experience. We were lucky that we didn't get hurt or have our souls possessed by the forces that we were dealing with. The experience taught me the importance of respecting the forces that we cannot see or comprehend. I still have a fascination with the occult and witchcraft and the supernatural in general, but now I approach it with respect, knowledge, preparation, and caution. I've realized that there's so much out there that we cannot fully understand or control, and that's why it's so important to spend our energy on what we can control. The experience also taught me that there are dark forces out there that are constantly trying to affect us in negative ways. It's up to us to use our God-given powers for good and to defeat those forces. We have the power to create positive change and to protect ourselves and those around us from the negative forces that exist in the world. It's a responsibility that I feel we all have, and I think it's important that we take it seriously. I grew up hunting with my dad, We would mostly do small game like rabbits and pheasants and such. It was a real bonding activity for us. So when I was in college in South Dakota and away from home, I would go out sometimes on my breaks and try to rekindle that feeling. I think I was pretty homesick during that first year of school. I also liked to hunt in some pretty remote areas. The place where this happened was somewhere I wasn't very familiar with, and it was quite a distance from where I had to park. I don't remember exactly how I found it. In those days, I really enjoyed finding places that were unpopulated as possible. The walk to where I wanted to go was a few miles from where I parked my truck. I started out a little after noon and figured I would hunt until dark and then come back out. I had my retriever Barney with me. The walk-in was a path that followed an abandoned farm road. It took us through some overgrown fields and some forested areas. We walked up this hill at the end of the road, and there was a bunch of abandoned buildings there. I remember I had read the story of that place, but I forget the particulars now. There was an old farmhouse and a building that had been used for a schoolhouse. There were also some barns and stables and other outbuildings. Apparently, the place had been abandoned a long time ago, like in the early 1900s. I was in front of the old house and I could see the spot where the old road left the forest and entered the fields. It was about 500 yards away, and I wanted to head to the clearing. I had a feeling it was a good place to spot pheasants, which were supposed to be plentiful in the area. It was a typical winter day, cold and overcast. I had my shotgun and bag, and Barney and I looked around the abandoned buildings for a while first. I didn't sense anything unusual. We found a place where we could lay low and observe any wildlife that showed up. We were there waiting for several hours, but didn't get much. And then just before dark, Barney and I packed up and started heading back to the truck. My dog was usually as easygoing and docile as any dog that ever lived. I had hardly ever heard him growl or seen him raise his hackles until that day. We climbed back up the hill to the old buildings to get to the road out, and when we got near the farmhouse, Barney started to act strange. He wouldn't walk in front of me like he usually did. He kept walking against my legs and would stop and make me almost fall over him. I spoke to him sternly and tried to get him to stay out from underfoot. We kept walking past all of the old buildings. When we had gone a little further, he began to stop and look back down the road toward the buildings. I would call him and he would catch up with me, but then he would stop again and stare back down the road. It was very slow going. And then he started to do this almost constant low growl. It wasn't a growl that I'd ever heard him do before. It honestly made all my hair stand on end. So I started walking faster, but he kept stopping and growling. I tried to coax him to keep up with me. I was looking back, but I couldn't see anything unusual. But I was really starting to feel nervous by the way he was acting. Finally, we reached the edge of the field just past the buildings, and I could see he had all of the hair on his back and shoulders standing on end. We proceeded to head back along the road toward the trees again, and I thought we were on our way. But then Barney turned around and bolted toward the closest shed. He was barking like crazy, and to my horror, I saw something emerge out of the doorway. Whatever it was so tall that it had to bend down to come out. I was then screaming at the top of my lungs for my dog to stop, but he kept going until he was about 20 feet in front of that thing, and he was just going ballistic. The thing looked like something out of a nightmare. Its face was wolf-like, but it had the most sinister expression on it, and the eyes seemed to have this red glow, and it was glaring at my dog like it was going to murder him. Its chest was huge, and its legs seemed canine. And then it started charging towards my dog, and I raised my shotgun and I got off a shot. It stopped the thing in its tracks, and then it turned and ran behind the building. I got to Barney and I grabbed his collar and dragged him away. I was so freaking mad at him for not listening to me, and I was screaming every obscenity at him, trying to get him to snap out of it and come with me. When I was close to that shed, I then smelled the foulest stench of rotten garbage that you can imagine. Finally, my freaking dog started running toward the trees with me, and we got the heck out of there. I'm not sure if my shot grazed that thing or not, but I heard this horrible howling sound as we were running away. We ran most of the 2 miles back to the truck, and by the time we were driving away, the dog and I looked like we had both just been to hell and back. Before that day, I never would have believed such a thing existed. If it hadn't been for the dog's reaction, I would not have even known that that thing was there. Who knows if it would have attacked me or Barney if I hadn't had that warning. In any case, we never went back to that spot again. That experience really makes me wonder what exists in those out-of-the-way places where not many other people go. Like, what lives out there? I tend to stick with the more populated areas since then, and I'm a lot more likely to use a leash these days. At the time this happened, I was working as the local journalist in my hometown of Troy, Michigan. In 2014, the editorial team asked me to follow a story from Detroit. Normally, I would jump on an opportunity to head out, but that time I had a strange feeling about it. Part of it was due to my uneasiness driving after my shoulder surgery, and partly due to knowing that Route 75 is said to be a paranormal magnet. I was pacing outside my boss's office thinking of an excuse to not go, and I noticed my coworker Frank was packing up his desk. I remembered that he was moving to another job outside of Troy, and that meant that my chance for a promotion was maybe finally here. So with that in mind, I decided to swallow my anxiousness and take on the story. I called my dad and asked if I could take his car. Young journalists are not paid enough to own one that's reliable yet. Detroit? Well, I can come along, and we can stop at your Uncle Sean's place, my dad said. I cringed from the inside, but agreed. He and I don't have much in common. I'm timid and antisocial, and he's outspoken and loud. However, I really wanted the Detroit story to help me with the promotion, and the road trip would probably mean a lot to him, too. Neither of us had any commitment after work, so we headed out right afterwards, straight down Route 75. He tried to churn up some conversation, but I was tired and I wanted to be fully awake the next morning. So I started to nod off in the car. Detroit is not too far from Troy, but every second felt like an hour. I do not remember when I actually fell asleep, probably when Dad started telling stories of a strange creature that had been seen lurking near Troy. Maybe I should have been paying attention. A little ways into the trip, I heard a loud thud, and I jumped and hit my head on the car window that I was leaning against. "Hey, are you up?" my dad said. "I think I saw something." "Probably it was nothing," he whispered. I shook my head no and just answered in murmurs. It was dark at this point, and we were no longer on 75. I remember making frustrated remarks, but his attention was completely somewhere else. His hands were gripping the steering wheel tightly, too. "You were asleep. There was an accident on 75. I knew a way to bypass it over here by the fairgrounds and the cemetery. Well, I thought I did, but I think we're lost." I rolled my eyes as I reached into my pockets to open the map on my phone. I tried to unlock my phone, but realized it was completely dead. I was so fixated on reaching Detroit that it had slipped my mind to charge it before leaving. The car kept moving along, but then it seemed to slow down. I opened my eyes wider, and I turned towards my dad to see his eyes wide open and staring in the rearview mirror. I still remember the look on his face, with his jaw hanging down. He kept driving slowly, but his eyes were glued to the rearview mirror. Not knowing what was going on, I asked him to let me drive. But my dad kept acting strange and not stopping. I asked him again to stop the car and switch seats with me. He was hesitant at first, but he finally agreed. I got out of the car, and soon after getting out, a noise from off in the direction of the cemetery caught my attention. I was looking around to find the source. I scanned the horizon looking for whatever it was, and what I saw was nothing like I could have ever imagined. It was a dark-haired, furry, wolf-looking creature, but it was huge, as big as a fully grown horse, I would say. I squinted my eyes, thinking it was a play of the light, but the bright yellow eyes that were staring back into mine were definitely real. Even though the creature was at least a few hundred feet away from us, its incredible size was clearly noticeable. Its presence behind our car, looking towards us, was something I could feel even that far away. I'll never forget the feeling I had when it first looked at us. It was majestic, and it had a sense of undeniable power. I felt it could make anybody feel shivers down their spine and make their hands quiver, just like I was feeling at that moment. However, I am a journalist, so I decided I could capture this beast with my camera and show people what I saw. I slowly moved my hand, reaching for the door handle while also reaching for my camera. In my head, I was moving slowly enough that I wouldn't be noticed by the creature who was still a decent distance away. Unluckily for me, I was wrong. The beast howled a cry at the most unbelievable spectrum, and it rose up on its two back feet. Its muscled body was now maybe 9 feet tall, and its dark fur made it seem even more ominous and horrifying. However, the strangest part of this vision was the creature's human-like build. The only typical wolf features were the tail, the sharp set of paws, and the end of each limb and the snarling wolf head. By this point, my dad had jumped inside the car to the passenger seat, and I had moved across to the driver's side. He quickly helped me to open the driver's door and yanked me inside and yelled to hit the accelerator. At first, I was in shock, but he pushed my knee and he slapped me to my senses. I then shut the door and pressed the pedal to its limit without even looking back into the rearview mirror. My hands were gripping the steering wheel white-knuckled, and they were still shaking as I drove away and tried to process what had just happened during those past 1 to 2 longest minutes of my life. My father saw it too, and he knew what he saw, but he could not verbally acknowledge it. But as far as I'm concerned, I hope it is the first and the last time I see the notorious Dogman of Michigan. I appreciate the opportunity to talk about this. I've tried bringing it up before, but it felt too weird. I'm from Colorado. I was born and raised here, mostly around Denver. I never felt comfortable in the city though, so I moved up towards the mountains when I got out of college. I got my civil engineering degree at CU Boulder. Boulder has a reputation for some pretty hippie types, but I was never one of those. I enjoyed my time there, but on the weekends when everybody was partying, I would head for the hills with my tent. I got to know some good, out-of-the-way spots. So because of that, I'm used to the critters that are around in the mountains. There's always deer and elk poking around the campsite looking for leftovers. The squirrels and chipmunks are maniacs. If you ever feed them, they'll never leave you alone again. The coyotes, they won't bother you. People can be scared of them, but personally I like listening to them at night. Just one time I had this scary situation with a mountain lion. It was just before sunset and I was coming back from a hike when all of a sudden it was just there, in front of me, on the trail. What you're supposed to do is make noise and make yourself look big and tough, and slowly back away. Somehow I managed to remember those 3 things even though I was really freaked out. The thing stared at me for a good long time, too. But then it just made this kind of snuffling noise and turned away like I wasn't worth bothering with. All that to say, I'm no stranger to the comings and goings of the resident creatures. We managed to coexist out there just fine. So again, after I finished my degree, I was hired to work at the old Moffett Tunnel. It's a railroad and water tunnel that cuts through the Continental Divide in north-central Colorado. So it's pretty high up there, almost 10,000 feet above sea level. It was given a National Historic Civil Engineering Landmark designation too, so I was honored to have the chance to work on it. I got an 18-month contract to work on the restoration. I stayed up there in an old cabin. Everybody else preferred to go back down to town at the end of the day, so I was alone a lot at night. It was great, though. Working hard during the day and having peace and quiet and starry skies at night. It's not for everybody, but I loved it. On weekends, though, a lot of times crazy kids would come up there to party. The tunnel was some kind of a magnet for them, I guess. The thing is 24 feet high, 18 feet wide, and 6 miles long. You can imagine the daredevil crap that they would get into. During the day, there are 15 trains that go through there. after I'd been up there for about 4 or 5 months, these carcasses started showing up near the tunnel entrance. First I was like, are these things getting hit by trains? But when I got a closer look, they obviously had been eaten with just remnants left behind. There got to be way too many of them to just be typical wild animal kills. I kept removing the piles of fur and bone and burying them as well as I could. I never saw any bears or even another mountain lion after that first one. But back to the college kids and how popular it was for them to come by and party up there. I guess it gave them a real charge to watch the trains speed by. I was worried that one of them was going to go too far and do something stupid. I sure wasn't prepared as a medic for foolish teenagers. They would come in the late afternoon, and then they would traipse through the woods acting like they were Robin Hood and his merry men. They definitely did not know what they're doing. And I'm not kidding you, that was their deal. When it got dark enough, they would come close to the tunnel and wait. Apparently, the lights and sounds from the trains would really send them to another dimension. They would be gasping and laughing and howling and dancing for hours. I don't know how you manage that much emotion for so long, but they sure did. One night, I tucked myself into bed in the cabin. It was midnight, and I could hear them out there, rioting around, but I was almost asleep. But then I heard screaming. At first, I thought it was part of all the craziness, but no, this was a blood-curdling scream. Somebody was scared. I jumped out of bed and into my pants, and I ran out there. They were all screaming, running in different directions. It was so dark that I couldn't see why, but I smelled something powerful, skunky. You know what I'm thinking. But at the same time, I had never seen those guys smoking. But then I could hear a train coming through the tunnel towards us. And when the light came through, I saw the outline of this huge, hairy beast. It was incredible, like 12 feet tall. I mean, the tunnel's 24 feet tall, and this thing reached halfway up of it, easily. It was growling loudly too, and it obviously was enraged by that crowd of kids. At this point, they were scattered everywhere, and I assumed that they all had made it back to their cars. The train then roared by and blocked off the sight of the beast. I ran back to the cabin and I locked myself in and was shaking in my boots. No way could something be that big. Have you heard of something like that out here in Colorado? It was like a Bigfoot or something. I thought they lived in Oregon or somewhere else. Do any of you know? I've been thinking, did this thing ride a train from out west? Okay, maybe I've been spending too much time alone, but my mind is really trying to figure this out. After that, I started going back to town to sleep at night with the other workers. After a few nights of silence after that, it got to be too much for me, too. Small towns come with their own dirty little secrets, and my hometown is no different. It's located about 30 minutes south of Oklahoma City, a tiny, blink and you'll miss it type of town. Slaughterville is literally a convenience store, a few housing additions, and like 4 intersections. But it's home to crazy, insane stories like the one I'm about to tell you. No one ever wants to really talk about this to outside people. We get tired of getting laughed at and made fun of. But I'm going to tell you anyway. Believe me, if you want, but at least hear me out. It was back in 2015. I had just moved back and was staying with my aunt and her family while I looked for my own place. I wasn't thrilled with staying in Slaughterville, but beggars can't be choosers, or whatever the saying is. I enjoyed being outside during the day. It was always fun to watch the kids on dirt bikes and 4-wheelers race up and down the red dirt road. But after dark, that's a whole other monster, and one that I didn't enjoy. We spent most of our time hanging out on the porch, laughing at the shenanigans, and watching the kids play. But once the sun started to set, we all headed back inside and hid out. We avoided the outside as much as we could after dark. On this night in particular, my boyfriend drove down to see me. I asked him to be there before dark, but his work held him up. I wasn't overly comfortable with hanging out in the car after dark, but I went ahead and I gave in. We had been outside for about 45 minutes when I could feel the energy around us change. The air got thick, and it felt electric. I shifted uncomfortably in my seat, and I was getting really anxious. Of course, he just kept talking. He had no idea what kind of weird things happened out here, especially after dark. I kept looking around the car as he chatted. I was trying to follow along, but honestly, I was distracted, really anxious. Something was off. And then I watched in horror as a young woman appeared in front of the car. She was gorgeous and wore an old hospital gown. She looked completely normal except for the fact that she was glowing faintly. I gasped and I pointed ahead of us out the window. My boyfriend covered his mouth and watched as this girl started floating closer to the car until she was right in front of the bumper. We both just watched silently as she raised her arm and then reached behind her head. I screamed when she pulled a giant knife from her back. It was stained red. I looked at my boyfriend in the next seat and grabbed his hand. I knew that nothing was going to happen to us, but I was terrified. He just kept his eyes glued to the spot in front of us. I turned back around and watched as the girl looked at us and started crying. She was begging for our help. My boyfriend started to open the door to get out, but I grabbed it and I yanked it shut. We could not get out and interact with whatever this was. I was sure it was trying to trick us. And then as the girl realized that we were not going to help, she got angry and the tears stopped. She then pointed the knife at us and started screaming. But the screams were all wrong. They came in waves. I had to let go of the door to cover my ears. We just stayed in the car, listening to this girl scream at us until she simply vanished. 1 second, she was there. The next, she was gone. My boyfriend looked at me with his eyes wide, panicked. I reached out and then I pulled him in to hug him. I was shaking and freaked out, and even though I knew what had happened out there, I couldn't imagine how he was feeling. We then both decided that maybe it was time to wrap up his visit and for him to just head back to the city. We said our goodbyes, and I made sure to let him know not to stop for any hitchhikers on the way out of town. Don't even stop if you see somebody walking on the road. Just drive by, I said. Picking up hitchhikers is not safe in general, and it's definitely not safe here. He agreed and headed home. But it was only 5 minutes before I got a frantic call. He was clearly panicking as he told me that at the stop sign there was an older woman in a gown walking towards his car. I told him to lock his doors and not to look at her, just drive. I stayed on the phone with him trying to calm him down. Once he turned out of the neighborhood and back onto the road to the highway, he noticed this black shadow following him. I just let him know to keep driving, but my blood ran cold. I could hear the fear in his voice as he told me that whatever it was that was behind him was keeping up, even as he sped back to the highway. I promised to stay on the phone even as he went in and out of service, making sure that I kept my voice calm. I know the creatures that live out here, but this figure didn't make sense even to me. And even as he described it to me, I tried to keep myself as calm as I could. It was a black shadow with no eyes. It appeared in the shape of a tall man, 7 to 8 feet tall, and fast. He was doing easily 80, and this thing was constantly in the rearview mirror. It followed him until he hit Norman city limits, when it growled low and deep, and suddenly disappeared. Only then did he feel safe enough to hang up. We still don't know exactly what followed him, but he isn't the only one to experience being followed. I have so many more stories I could tell you, but we'll just leave it with this one for now. I have always had a passion for literature. As a child, I spent my summers reading and writing stories about magic, mythical creatures, and fantasy. I wrote stories about monsters, some old and some new, and I recited them proudly in front of my parents. I ran the school's paper in high school, and 2 of my stories were even published by the time I graduated. At this point, it's safe to assume I wasn't exactly popular, but that never got to me. I was much happier living vicariously through the worlds I created on paper than engaging in American youth culture. College was when I finally got to see both edges of the sword. While I felt confident in my studies and my ability to manifest the career I wanted, I realized that I was incredibly naive when it came to dating, friendships, and basically every aspect of social life. So when I started dating Sam, I wasn't nearly as prepared as I thought I would be. I figured that real life and fiction couldn't really be all that different, and I had read and written hundreds of stories involving romance. I thought I would at least have a chance. Sam was unlike any character I'd ever encountered. Sam was even a bigger dork than I was, but that's one of the things that I loved about him. That he was an expert on early European folklore, and we were both planning to get our master's degrees. But Sam didn't like to share his original work with me. I begged and pleaded so many times to just read a page, but he declined every time. I didn't want to push it. As a writer myself, I knew how scary the process could be. But I was Sam's partner, and I always shared my writing with him, so it started to make me a little uncomfortable. But it's not like bringing that up to Sam was an easy task. No, this conversation almost always ended in an argument. Sam was a year ahead of me in school, and graduation was approaching. There was a giant final project coming up for him, and he'd been typing away furiously for most of the semester. I noticed that as the writing process progressed, Sam withdrew. We had never had a problem with intimacy or anything like that in our past, but something had definitely changed. One night, about a month before graduation, I tried to fix the problem. I prepared a lovely dinner and made the apartment and myself look nice. I missed Sam, and I wanted him to want me, but he basically disregarded everything as soon as he got home. There was too much writing to be done. I was a distraction. I couldn't believe it. I flipped out, and I demanded to see what he was working on. He made it clear that he didn't have time to fight with me that night. He was going to write at the library, so he grabbed his laptop and rushed out the door. I was speechless. If it was space that he wanted, how much more could I give? But Sam was so defensive every time I tried to bring things up, it made me wonder if all the trouble had been worth it. So I finished my glass of wine, threw on my coat, and headed for the library. I needed him to know I was serious. I did wish that our place off campus was closer to the library, though. It was still pretty cold that time of year in Connecticut, especially at night, and the seclusion of campus didn't really help. As a scary story connoisseur, I wasn't too fazed by the whole dark, stormy night cliché, but I knew a chill when I felt one. I checked my watch and I realized it was just after midnight. Great. Sam was such a pain, I thought. The library was a pretty isolated, standalone building at the far end of campus, and since Sam was probably the only one inside, the warm glow of the ceiling lights felt dimmer. It was quiet when I stepped inside, and the chill never left me. I could see a dozen empty tables and the characteristic walls of shelved books, but no Sam. I decided to look for him in the aisles. I went to the section with early-age folklore, where I knew he pulled most of his research. And when I turned into the aisle, I stopped. That stretch of floor was littered with crumpled balls of paper, some torn or stained with this translucent brown substance. And then there were the poor hardbacks from which the pages had been torn. They were tossed aside like garbage by whoever had done this. But the most peculiar thing was that the balled-up pages were completely blank. I was puzzled. I walked down the aisle, stooped to pick up random wads to confirm my findings. It was so sad to see the destruction of these books. And then at the end of the row, I saw the papers trailing into the next aisle over. I followed, and when I turned the corner, I gasped. There was Sam, hunched over a half-destroyed hardback with an engraved cryptid on the front. I watched in horror as he greedily stuffed the handful of paper into his mouth, chewed it, and then threw the wet, wordless page down. His lips were ringed with black ink and saliva, and his expression was that of an alcoholic working behind a bar. He was simply devouring the pages, sucking the words out of them and decimating the place of origin. I was appalled at every aspect of what was happening before me. Sam? I said his name sternly, and he snapped his focus at me. For a second, I was afraid, but then it washed away. I suddenly knew that Sam was a fraud. He hissed at me, and I guess it should have been more frightening than I felt, but I was not afraid of him for some reason. I felt pity for anything. I felt that he was pathetic. And then he scurried away from my sight, and that was the last I saw of him. In a lot of ways, I know Sam wasted my time, but there's a bigger part of me that's appreciative of how badly things ended. I think I needed to see him in the act to finally come to terms with how things were failing. Sam showed me the ugly truth about love, one that I could never accept through the writings of another person. And in that, Sam taught me that sometimes life is stranger than fiction. A few friends of mine and I were really big into supernatural exploration back in college. We would explore just about anywhere we could in hopes of catching something on camera or even some kind of evidence ourselves. Around that time, plenty of ghost tracking shows were out, but we wanted to start our own supernatural hunting channel. We dug deep, and we researched just about every state and finally made our way to Roswell, New Mexico. In the late 40s, an unidentified object crash-landed in a farmer's field there, and there was debris left behind. We mapped out the surrounding area, hoping our metal detectors and equipment would pick up something, anything. It may have been a long shot, but we were hungry for content. I was also the video camera operator while my friends Ginny and Brett used metal detectors and thermal cameras. We set up shop nearby at a hotel and geared up. We waited for nighttime to fall just so we wouldn't look like quacks on the hunt in the day. I had mapped out the perimeter of where the unidentified object crashed, and we worked our way around. The wooded area that night had an undeniable eerie feeling, but that only fueled our curiosity. It was my job to keep the camera rolling at all times to document every second along the way. And then only an hour into our walk, Ginny had picked up something from the metal detector. Brett quickly busted out the shovel, and he dug around. Mind you, the crash was over 60 years ago, so the chances of us finding much of anything were fairly slim. But then with the metal detector going off, it gave us all hope. He was digging for a good 15 minutes, but still nothing. We scanned the shallow hole once more, and it went off again. Whatever was there must have been pretty deep. Jenny hopped in and dug too, just to speed things up. And then not long after, we heard a thud. They had struck something. We all lit up, and I aimed the camera at them as they carefully dug around whatever the object was. The light on my camera illuminated some sort of casing. It seemed to be an open box of some sort, and the only content appeared to be shedded skin, almost like a snake. Brett scooped up the scaly skin and tucked it into a Ziploc. I figured it could just be snake skin, but it could have been something else. Ginny then marked the hole we dug with a red marker flag so we would know we had already combed that spot. And then we pressed onward to the open field. We thought the field could be the outskirts of where the crash had happened. I panned across the field with my camera, looking out a ways, and far off in the distance, I noticed some movement. "Wait, I think I saw something. Let's head that way," I said. And then we all walked in that direction, and suddenly the camera started freezing and malfunctioning. I thought to myself that, of course, when I pick up something, the camera starts to act up. It was pretty old, so I figured it must have just been acting up since I had filmed a while already. We were all focused on the camera then, and then we heard more movement from the same direction. Everybody's eyes shut up, and the moon illuminated a figure off in the distance. I scrambled to get the camera going, but it shut off, and then it refused to turn back on. I was cursing under my breath, more frustrated that I was missing out on content due to the camera malfunction. Jenny was the first then to notice that the figure was getting closer. "Who's there?" she blurted out. But there was no response. But we all watched as it continued walking closer. We all then started to back away, but still tried to make out who it was that was coming at us. I squinted beyond the dark abyss and noticed that the outline felt like it was about the height of a child. I paused, thinking it could have been some kid who had gone out exploring like us and got lost. "I think it's just a kid, guys," I said, walking towards the figure. I was then about 20 feet away, and before I was able to see the face, I dropped to the ground. It had simultaneously let out a loud, unbearable shriek, which immobilized me. When I fell to the ground, I saw that it had also affected Brett and Ginny, and all we could do was cup our ears and roll around on the ground. I vaguely remember squinting and seeing the figure kneel by us and pick up the bag of scaly skin that we had found. Even though I could see a little bit, my vision seemed to be impaired by the deafening sound surrounding us. I wasn't able to make out what it looked like at all. The only sense of mine that seemed to be fully functioning was my nose, and I distinctly remember smelling a strange odor, almost sulfurous. And that's the last thing I remember. The next thing I know, I was sitting up gasping for air. I glanced over to see my friends were coming to at about the same time, slowly moving around on the ground. I also noticed that it felt like my eardrums had nearly burst, and my hearing was just slowly coming back. I crawled over to my friends and then remembered seeing that I had watched that thing digging through the bag. I looked around for the bag, but it was gone. It was the only evidence that we had come up with, and now it was taken. We couldn't even be mad because whatever we encountered was proof enough, at least to us. None of us said it, but we all knew that we had come across something extraterrestrial, and that we had found something that it had wanted. By the time we gathered ourselves and stood up, we were all speechless. I reached down for my camera, which of course was now working fine. I chuckled to myself a bit as we headed back to the car. We were near the spot where we had dug up the box, but none of us saw the freshly dug hole. The dirt seemed to all be flat and untouched, but there stood the red marker that we had stuck in the ground. We had so many questions, the first of which was, what being did we just encounter? Why was the hole that we had dug miraculously covered up? One thing was for certain, whatever it was didn't want us leaving with any trace of something out of the ordinary. I feel that was the weirdest part about all of this. The next morning, Ginny and Brett don't recall ever even exploring out there with me. They denied being out there at night, and instead they claimed that we had spent the night in. They were so convincing that I even started to question myself and wonder, was it all just a dream? It couldn't have been. I'm sure of it. I was so eager to prove them wrong that I went to my camera looking for film. But it was wiped clean. Well, almost. The only bit of film I was able to recover was a quick clip, no longer than 10 seconds. In the video, you see me drop to my knees just as the shrieking audio starts, and then the clip ends. I was only able to identify myself in the video because you can briefly see my red chucks. Of course, when I went to show them the clip, it had vanished. To this day, I know what I saw and what truly happened, but I always wonder why I was the only one who remembered. It all started when my dad and I were driving down a stretch of road in the northwestern part of South Carolina in 2019. We hadn't been out on that road for years because we had moved away long ago. But one weekend we found ourselves passing by it on the highway, and we decided to drive around our old town again. In hindsight, this was a terrible idea. As we cruised along the road heading into town, I watched the woods roll by with tall pines on either side. It was early autumn, and the crazy hot and humid days of summer were long gone. Now the air was crisp, with a hint of dampness. I sat there thinking that this weather reminded me of the scary stories we would tell as kids sitting by the campfire. One of the stories that I heard a million times in those days was about dogmen who live in the shadows of the woods around here. The story always described how they're said to be a strange cross between dogs and men, but mostly dog-like in appearance. often having dog heads with backwards ears and straggly hair covering their bodies. Some say they walk and run on 2 legs, but who knows about that? Also, they're known for their terrifying howls that echo through the forest at night. I hadn't thought about any of these stories in years at this point, but as we drove through this forest that I always played in as a child, my mind began wandering into that dark place of scary stories. Now that's what I was thinking about as I looked out the car window, and because of that, the pine trees were no longer just familiar. They now turned into a place where these crazy creatures were lurking behind every tree. I turned to ask my dad if he remembered hearing the same stories, and as I turned, I caught a glimpse of something strange, something out of place, out of the corner of my eye. I thought to myself, there's no way. I could see that something was crouching on the other side of the road and looking our way with its face low to the ground, and this crazy mouth hanging open wide. I stared back in shock because I couldn't believe or even trust what I was seeing. It was just too much of a coincidence. I couldn't be seeing this. My mind was surely creating it because of my thoughts. But it was true. There, laying low to the ground, was something odd staring towards us with a dog-like head and human-like arms and body. I gasped, but before my dad could turn to see what I was looking at, the thing dashed into the woods without making a sound. Or so I thought. As my dad drove down the road, I could hear him describing all of the old buildings from where we lived, and I nodded along, trying to fight off a growing sense of dread that had been creeping up on me since I saw that thing. I should have told my dad about it because it was all I could think about right then, but I was too scared that he would think I was crazy. But then suddenly my dad slammed on the brakes and I jerked my head up to look out the windshield, and there, standing in the middle of the road, was the ugliest creature I have ever seen. It had straggly, mangy hair, and it stood there barking at us furiously. Its teeth were bared and its body was crouched and sort of low to the ground with muscles rippling beneath the skin of its legs. And they weren't furry, by the way, and they weren't bent in the way that a dog's legs would bend. Its head looked like a furry mass of knots, but its eyes pierced right through it all. And then they locked with mine. Our car was stopped within 20 feet of the thing, and before we could do anything, it started walking towards us quickly and purposely, barking loudly and aggressively with its teeth still bared. And I wondered right then and there if these things were any match for a car. I knew from stories that they could be aggressive, but I wasn't sure if they were dangerous to humans, and the car was our only protection at that point. My dad, who was still sitting in the driver's seat, grabbed his cell phone to call 911, and he dialed frantically. I looked behind us, hoping we could back up and leave there faster than this monster that was closing in on us. Luckily, my dad was able to describe to the police exactly where we were because it wasn't far from our old neighborhood. And then just as he hung up, the creature stopped right in front of the car and snarled one last time before it turned its back on us, swaggered away casually with its head swinging back and forth with every few steps. It never even looked back, which really sent the message as to who was in charge of the situation. I watched it go until it disappeared into the pine forest. I looked down at my shaking hands and said to my dad, "Do you think that they have been here all along? Like, even since we lived here?" And that's when we heard a blood-curdling howl that echoed through the trees. The sound sent chills right up to the top of my head. I looked back at my dad, and that's when the police car pulled up. At least nothing would be able to harm us now, I thought. We told the officer what we had just encountered, and he took our statement and said that he's had other reports like this over the years. He also said that he personally thinks that they've lived here in the forest for at least 50 years, if not more. I slowly looked over at my dad, whose eyes were wide open, and then back up at the police officer. He was now staring into the woods like he could see it out there. While I was strangely relieved to hear that these things were real, something told me that they would never be taken seriously by anybody who didn't actually see one themselves. I stared out into the vastness of the trees, and I could have sworn that I felt the presence of more than one of them, watching us. and just waiting to pounce again. I'm still thinking about it almost 2 years later, and my dreams and my nightmares are plagued with these things, with the howls of the dog man and its eyes staring at me. I've never felt so afraid in all of my life as I was that day, but even though they still terrify me to this day, I still make myself think about them, and I wonder about what they really are. How did they come to really be? Are they really part human? And what are they exactly? If you have any thoughts, please leave a comment so I can read what you think. It would really help me out. 3 friends and I went out for a hunting trip on the Mescalero Apache Reservation. It's about a 100-mile drive northeast of Las Cruces, New Mexico. It's not really something I can recommend unless you have a buddy on your trip who is native. I mean, I did, but even then, I felt shaky driving onto the reservation. They do have these kind of package trips for tourists, but we said to hell with that, and we just headed in on our own. Anyway, the area is pretty rich with deer and elk in general, but my buddy claimed to know a place way deep in the reservation that was a sweet spot for him. We're talking dirt trails with branches scraping the sides of the truck. By the state of things, I would say it was a safe bet that we were going to be out there on our own. The trail ended in a jumble of boulders, and from there it was about a half-mile hike. From the second we got out of the pickup, I was uneasy. Let me just say that John was the only native guy in our group of 4, so maybe I was already on edge, worried if we should really be there. The whole time we were on the climb, I kept looking over my shoulder. Mike chuckled at me a few times, and I had to wonder if I was the only one that was uneasy about things. John was up in front, shoving ahead like everything was aces, so I did what I could to just shake it all off. We finally hit the ridge he was leading us to, and things cleared up around a pretty good-sized lake. I asked where the best place was for us to hunker down and wait, and he said we should fan out in different positions to get our best shots. Again, I wasn't crazy about it, but who was I to argue? In the end, I headed off along the west side so that the lake was down the valley on my left, and my back was to the mountain. I couldn't put my finger on it, but I just didn't feel right. That same nagging feeling that I had had since getting out on foot only kicked up more once I was on my own. I can't say I was worried about bears or anything, but I can tell you that elk were not the first thing on my mind. Now, this is coming from a guy who has spent a fair amount of time outdoors in all kinds of weather, any time of the day or night. I just felt something was off. As soon as I set up shop, I got a chill all over. Not your typical November breeze chill either. All the hair on the back of my neck stood up, and a cold sweat broke out under my arms. I was being watched. I could feel it. Somebody else was out there, and they weren't too happy about me just making myself at home. Without trying to look too uneasy, I started looking around to see if I could get a bend on whoever might be out there. But no matter what direction I looked, I couldn't spot a soul, not even one of our own guys. And then all of a sudden, this smell comes up like rotten meat, like a carcass left out in the sun, but even stronger, if that's possible. And it just comes up out of nowhere. I was about to gag and my eyes were watering, and I figured it was time to pull up shop and leave the spot behind. So I stood up and something to my right moved. We're talking big. It's a wonder I missed something that size given how hard I had been scanning the area. Rubbing my eyes to get the stink tears out of them, I made out a set of antlers. Anybody would have been proud to have seen those on their wall. And sitting right there, less than 50 feet to my right, was what looked like an elk the size of a truck. But there was something wrong about it. My eyes were still trying to focus, and the damned thing stood up on its hind legs. It had to be the better part of 8 feet tall. That smell washed over me again, and I stumbled back a step or two. I was completely bewildered. This thing looked right at me, and it had no eyes. Just sockets. And then it reached out its front leg like it was going to steady itself on a tree. And I saw that the leg doesn't have a hoof on the end. It has a hand. That was enough for me. I went tearing back down to where we had all split up, yelling like hell. The other guys came jogging up from their spots, and I got to John first. I told him exactly what I just saw, and the other two guys just started laughing. But not John. John went all pale and said, "Wendigo." It's the first time I had ever heard the word, but I will never forget it. That's all he said. And then we started booking it back to the truck. We were making so much noise, tearing back down the mountain. I couldn't hear if anything was after us. We were literally 4 grown men at a dead run, making a hell of a lot of noise. We were all sweating by the time we made it back to the truck, piled in, and fired it up. John had been carefully inching along the trail our whole way out there, but he ripped back out of there so hard it's a wonder he didn't rip out the undercarriage. We didn't slow down until we made it back to 70, and even then he pushed the limit all the way back into Ruidoso. Ever since then, there have been a few times that it has come up again, since the other 2 guys like to wisecrack, but I always keep an eye on John when this happens, and all I can tell you is this: he is never laughing, and I will never set foot in Mescalero again. I will do anything to avoid it. I used to be skeptical of stories like these, cryptids, aliens, conspiracies in general. It all seemed like a bunch of nut jobs or people just desperate for attention. Well, after the events of the last few weeks, I've reconsidered. I live in a small town in Pennsylvania called Marcus Hook, but I grew up here and I went to college in Philadelphia. My parents moved to Florida a few months ago, but they're keeping their house here, and I'm living in it right now. It's right on the bank of the Delaware River. For the first few months, it was pretty cool. A 22-year-old guy with his own house is a pretty big deal. But at first, I was stupid, and I threw a ton of parties, and I always had my friends over. But after summer ended and people started going back to school or finding real jobs, it all began to wind down. I was okay with that. I needed some time for peace and quiet anyway. Unfortunately, that's not what happened. The river was just maybe 20 yards from the back door of the house. I worked odd hours at my new job, and I found myself staying up later and later. I was bored and with nobody else to hang out with besides my dog, Sprint. I started fishing in the river like I did when I was a kid. I wouldn't eat anything from the water, but catching catfish using pepperoni pieces was a novelty. And most nights I would wind up outside in a lawn chair until 3 a.m. It was on a night like this when the first incident happened. I wasn't paying too much attention. I was watching something on my phone and my rod started bouncing around like crazy. I jumped up to set the hook, jerking it back. The line went slack for a second and then jerked away. I figured I had a fish on, but when I tried to reel again, it wouldn't budge. I thought maybe I was snagged, but then the line snapped away again. I'm not an expert fisherman, but the way the line moved was odd. Not like a typical fish bite, but like something in the water was purposely pulling back on the line each time I did. Almost like it was intelligent. I was a little freaked out, and I ended up just cutting the line and heading back inside. I told myself it was caught on a snag or something, but I suspected otherwise. A week later, another incident. I had fallen asleep in my chair, and I woke up startled after hearing a large splash in the water just a few yards out. The light from my back porch just barely hit the edge of the water, and I could see a series of rings spreading out from where something had entered the water. A new set of rings then appeared a few feet away, and then again and again until they were out of sight. I was a little baffled, as catfish are bottom feeders and such. They seldom come to the surface of the water, and they rarely jump. I grabbed my gear and I headed inside, but in my groggy state, I left my cutting board, knife, and a fresh bag of pepperoni sitting on the ground outside. The next day, I realized what I had done, and I went outside to retrieve it. It was all gone. In the patchy dirt near where I had left the stuff, I could see faint prints. Some kind of thin-footed animal with only 2 long, slender toes had been walking through the area. Also, I found silvery fish scales, that were spread sporadically around, and both the prints and the scales led straight back to the water's edge. I must admit that at this point I was a little bugged out. I didn't know what to make of the evidence, but I figured that any kind of call to the police was going to get me laughed at. I tried to find information on the prints online, but no luck. I decided that I would give fishing a rest for a while. I needed to get better sleep anyway. I was starting to get tired halfway through the day at work, so 2 weeks went by and I hadn't been back outside to fish. And then I started dating a new girl, Ruth, and between her and work, I pretty much forgot all about the tracks. And then, the most bizarre incident of all occurred. I was fast asleep in the room upstairs when I was shaken awake by my new girlfriend. She told me that Sprint was downstairs barking like crazy. I'm a heavy sleeper and probably wouldn't have noticed, but sure enough, he was downstairs going nuts. Before I reached the stairs, his barking abruptly cut off, and then it turned into a low growl. I felt a small twinge of panic. Ruth was behind me on the stairs, and we crept down quietly. I could see Sprint standing at the back door, rigid posture, growling at something outside. I walked quietly over to him, and I tried to calm him down. I was stroking his head when I heard Ruth let out a gasp. She was looking through the small window of the back door. I stood up to look myself, and that small twinge of panic turned into a hammering. 2 bipedal creatures no more than 3 feet tall were treading around my backyard. It was dark and the lights were off, but I could make out a pallid silver color to them. No eyes that I could see, but something like a fin was running along the spine of each creature. We stood frozen for a few moments watching these 2 creatures. At one point they ambled over to each other, and I swear to God they were making hand gestures towards the house. Ruth saw this too and whispered that she was going to call the cops, and then she ran upstairs to grab her phone. I stayed and watched for a few more minutes. Sprint took up his barking again, and this time both creatures just ambled away towards the river and disappeared under the water. The police came about 20 minutes later and looked around. They didn't see any sign of the creatures, but said that they had found some wet prints outside. They were the exact same ones that I had seen on the ground a few weeks ago. Since no crime was committed, they didn't seem too interested, but the officers took my report and told me to call again if anything else happened. So this was a week ago. I've looked online for any kind of information on these creatures, but I can't find anything. I haven't gotten a good night's sleep since, and Ruth has refused to come back to the house. Does anybody out there know what these things are? And if you do, are they dangerous? When I think back to the day that I saw this, I start to question myself. I think it's normal to try and rationalize things because you know other people won't believe you. And I know someone out there is probably thinking, well, if you can't be sure what you saw, how is anyone else supposed to believe what you're saying? I guess you don't really know what to think or believe when you've been in a situation like this. I'll be honest, I'm not a diehard skeptic, but I wasn't ever a true believer of things like Bigfoot or whatever either. So when I saw what I think I did, my first instinct was always to find a logical explanation for it. But it doesn't always explain everything away. I'll try to explain the events the best I can. I know there will be things to question, but try your best to put yourself in my shoes as I tell it. I remember the day was very windy. There was a carnival in town, and it was the final day that it would be available to the public. I had promised my niece and nephew that I would take them since I hadn't been able to spend much time with them that month. They were still pretty young. I'd say my niece was about 6 and my nephew about 8. I remember thinking, I hope the wind isn't too much for them. Both of them had been very afraid of storms when they were growing up. I didn't want them to be afraid of the wind. I was worried it would ruin their time at the carnival. But we didn't have any other option. It was the last day, and that's where they wanted to go. I did bring some activities for the car ride, but I thought that if things got really bad with the wind and all, we could just wait it out in my car. I had one of those station wagons, so the back was big and spacious. I even brought extra blankets and snacks. Anyway, I hadn't picked them up yet, but was on my way, so I had my window down. I genuinely liked the wind and the rain. It always smelled fresh to me. I mean, compared to the station wagon, everything smelled much, much cleaner. But as I was driving along the road, I started to hear this weird, high-pitched screeching. At first, I just thought it was somebody's brakes, but the sound stayed very much the same, even as I passed by different cars. So then I started thinking, the sound has to be my brakes. So then I started listening every time I hit the brakes, but it didn't seem to be mine either. And that's when I realized that the sound wasn't coming from the area of the road. It was actually coming from the trees off to my left. It probably wouldn't have bothered me if the sound wasn't so disturbing and different. And it just kept happening over and over again. So then I thought, maybe it's a goose or something that got injured in the wind, right? That would make sense. Geese make noises like that, right? So I'm doing my best to look out the window as I'm driving, but now moving at a relatively slow pace. I didn't see any geese in the sky or the trees, so now I'm really confused. But that's when I did notice something moving along the base of the trees. It's going to sound stupid, but at first I thought I saw a llama running through the trees. So my mind starts thinking about the carnival and this thing that looks like a llama. I even had a light bulb moment where I'm like, the llama escaped the petting zoo at the carnival. That made the most amount of sense. Maybe the llama got loose because the wind had been so wild. Maybe the gate broke. Maybe somebody had accidentally let it out. I know it was absurd, but at least it was logical. So I'm starting to feel okay about it all. I should have felt bad for the llama, but I didn't really think beyond any of that. I felt bad admitting it, but I didn't really care about the llama. I was just happy that it explained the screeching to me. So I'm still driving, but then I continued to hear the weird screeching. But then I was like, whatever at this point. And that's when I noticed the car ahead of me stomp on their brakes. So of course, I jump on mine. The person in the car gets out of their vehicle and they start looking out towards where I saw the llama. So I'm like, great, now everybody's going to stop to look at this llama on the side of the road. And then they all start pointing, and somebody else gets out of the car. I'm watching all of this, and I'm trying to figure out what they're saying, trying to read their lips. And that's when they start to point higher. So I wonder what they're doing, and then I look in the direction they're pointing, and I see the llama, like, hovering in the trees. And then it's gone, just like that. And with that, the screeching stops. Like everything that was happening moments before is just done. It all ceases. So now I'm thinking, did the llama just fly away? And sure enough, I hear the people in front of me shouting something about wings. Now, I didn't see any wings, but wings would be a good explanation for what happened. I don't know if they thought they saw the llama with some wings or if some winged thing grabbed the llama. I really can't explain any of that. All I know is that I saw something that resembled a llama. It was clearly distressed, and then it disappeared. As far as I know, it was only the car in front of me who also witnessed exactly what I had. I did eventually try to pull up to the side of their vehicle to talk to them, but they looked like they really didn't want to talk to me. They even looked kind of shook up, so I decided to just continue on. I guess I don't have much of a story, but I wanted to share this with you nonetheless. All I can think is that I'm just glad that my niece and nephew weren't in the car with me. If they had been, I would really be trying to figure out an explanation. I've heard stories like these, but I never thought it would happen to me, especially since I live in the suburbs. I mean, stuff like this is supposed to happen in isolated areas, right? I guess it can happen anywhere. I don't know now. It was late at night, everyone was asleep besides me and my dog Ollie. It was a Friday night and I stayed up to relax from work. I was just watching TV, really, flipping through the channels, nothing really in particular. I ended up staying on some sitcom, I think, until Ollie started acting weird. At first, he just raised his head a few times, looking at the window and the door. After a while, though, he started to growl, and then he got up and started pacing. Something was outside, and he wasn't very happy about it. His hair was standing on end, and he wouldn't stop even when I told him to quiet down. I didn't want him to get hurt, so I put him in his crate, and I put my shoes and jacket on. It was November, a week before Thanksgiving, so it was pretty chilly, and there was some light snow on the ground. I turned on one of the outdoor lights, and I headed outside. I didn't hear anything at first. The wind was starting to pick up, though, and I first thought it was just leaves blowing around. Something, though, made me feel weird. I can't really describe it. So I picked up a shovel that was leaning against the house. I had to use it a few days before to dig up the flower beds. At first I thought I was being stupid. You're in your own backyard, what are you doing? I looked around the garage, the deck, and along the fence line. I didn't see anything. It wasn't until I walked back towards the back door that movement caught my eye. Just a shadow at first? I don't know. I look up towards the roof and start walking back a little to get a better look. And that's when I see it, trying to hide itself by the chimney and gripping the roof, trying to make itself look small as possible. The thing was short, maybe 4 feet or 4.5. It was hard to tell because it was on all fours, but its legs and arms were long and skinny. It seemed to have some sort of nails or claws. It was hard to tell. They were dug in pretty good. It was its face, though. That's what I still dream about the most. It was pale, and the whole thing really was like a chalky white gray, maybe more gray than white. It was dark out, but this thing was pretty light, and its head seemed big, but maybe that's because its body was so thin. And its eyes were huge, and they kind of glowed with the light that they caught, like a dog's or a cat's will do. It had slits for a nose, and its mouth was kind of trembling at first. But when it opened to hiss at me, I could see sharp teeth. I think its tongue was pointed. It shot out a little when it hissed. I didn't know what to think or do at first, but when it started moving, I remembered the shovel in my hands. I just held it up at first, but the thing kept moving. So then I started swinging it at the edge of the roof. The thing moved like a cat, very nimble and pretty fast too. I thought maybe I could reach it if I was up on the deck. So I run up the stairs, and this thing is staring right at me. I swing the shovel again, and at first it backed up and moved out of the way a bit. But when I swung maybe the 3rd time, it reached out and slapped the blade of the shovel, knocking it back and hissing. I didn't want it to leap down on top of me. Something in my head was screaming at me that would be extremely bad. So I recover as best as I can, and I start to jab the blade of the shovel at it now. That's when it smacked the shovel again, hard enough that I lost my balance and came crashing to the deck. The shovel was now too far away for me to reach it. It had fallen to the deck and bounced away from where I fell. I just closed my eyes and I waited for this thing to drop down on me. It never did, though. I then opened my eyes back up, got up, and there was nothing on the roof. It seemed to be gone. I didn't want to chance it, though. I don't know if my adrenaline was just pumping out of control or what. But I go into the garage and I get a ladder. I also grabbed a hatchet, and I put the ladder against the roof and climbed up. I searched the entire roof. I looked at my neighbors' roofs. There was nothing. I woke up my wife in the process, and she was extremely confused and concerned. I came down, put the ladder and the hatchet away, and then came inside. I made sure everything was locked up tight, and then I told her the story. She said she believed me, but I wasn't sure. Not until the next day. It was hard to sleep, and I got only maybe 2 hours. I'm not really sure. I then went back out in the morning, and I went back up on the roof to look around in the daylight. And that's when I saw them. There was a group of shingles that had deep gouges in them, like claw marks, near and around the chimney. I pulled those free and brought them back down to show my wife. That really seemed to sink into her mind, because the look she gave me was something else. I don't know what I saw or what I tried to fight off. I replaced the shingles, and I've stayed up a few nights. It's hard to sleep now. The thing hasn't come back, though, and I don't know if it will. If it wasn't for Ollie, I don't know if we would be alive. Thank you for your videos. They've helped me so much because until now, I felt really alone in this. But now, I know that what happened to me isn't uncommon. I know I'm not crazy, And there are so many more things like it out there, things that others have seen. But I'm writing to request your help. I've been telling my story for years, but nobody believes that it was what it was. They all say that it's impossible. But I know that I'm not crazy, and I saw it. It happened about a year ago at my small local college in rural Pennsylvania. The day it happened was an otherwise typical day. I went straight to the library after class. It was fall, you know, leaves changing, crisp breezes, and lots of apple spice everywhere you look. Anyway, it was late when I finally left the library that day. The walk back home was about 20 minutes or so, but only around 10 minutes if I cut through the little forest path from the college. I was tired that night from working on a big assignment, and so, of course, I chose the 10-minute shortcut back home. Any other day I would have been fine. Nothing terrible ever happened there. I regret making that choice now, though. But you know what they say, hindsight is 20/20. About 3 minutes into the woods, I heard this awful, terrible sound of hammering on the trees all around me, as if someone was using every last ounce of their strength to slam rocks into the wood until it cracked in the air, sounding like gunshots, followed by a noise almost like an ape whooping. Usually the woods smelled like, well, woods. But on this day, it smelled like somebody had gotten too drunk and used the path as their urinal. It reeked so badly that I thought somebody must have thrown garbage on the path. So I need to describe exactly how it smelled. It was musty garbage, urine, and a wet dog. That would be the best way to describe it. I know that I should have turned around after I heard the knocking, but I was just in such a rush to get home, and I didn't want to do any backtracking. Plus, I never in a million years thought that it would be what it turned out to be. At the halfway point along the path is when I saw this thing, this creature. It was standing about 8 feet tall with dark reddish brown, what I can only describe as fur, covering its entire body. It was still a way down the path, in front of me. From this distance, it looked like somebody had taken one of those weird hunting suits and put animal fur all over it. It was a weirdly tall somebody with massive shoulders that were hunched together, and it had the most insane framework that I've ever seen. It was just honed like no other body that I've ever seen. I can remember some of the gym rats in campus showing off, but this thing, whatever it was nothing like that. This was just a wall of fur and muscle. The creature didn't see me until I started to move again. I thought I was being quiet enough not to get caught. I was wrong. The next thing I knew, it was turning around and looking at me with those soulless, beady black eyes that seemed to bore into my skull. When our eyes met, I swear it felt like my head was full of pressure. This thing's face was hairless, much like an ape. It had a strange cone head with a strong brow ridge, big protruding lips that didn't seem like they could fully close around the big white teeth. The thing was coming at me, and in fact it was now within an arm's reach of me, and then I finally seemed to snap back to reality. The disgusting smells I had caught a whiff of earlier were now so intense that my eyes were burning and watering. The musky scent of its body was tickling my nose now too. I closed my eyes, wishing it all to go away, and I could barely open them when I felt one of its oversized hands touch me. But luckily, I could now hear another group of students who were also coming our way. Miraculously, the sound of the ground crunching below their feet and their loud voices were enough to scare the creature away. I opened my eyes to realize that it had stopped approaching, and I watched as it ran off in the opposite direction. I bolted once I could no longer see it, running nonstop until I couldn't breathe. My chest was burning and the scent of urine was still fresh in my memory. In the end, it took me 15 minutes to get home. I don't even remember walking the rest of the way. My mind was too focused on making sense of what I had just experienced. The smell was gone when I returned to the path the next day with a friend. I had told him about it, and I wanted to go back to see if I was crazy or not. But no signs of what I'd seen or what had happened remained. Not even a footprint was left in the mud. My friend was kind, but tried to come up with a more realistic explanation when I told him about it. But even if I imagined it all, which I didn't, I still will never go back on that path in the dark, and I definitely won't step on that trail alone. No one I know has had a similar experience. Do you have any suggestions on what you think I saw or what happened? I'd like some answers. It would help me to find closure on what was the scariest night of my life. Thank you again for doing such a groundbreaking show and allowing me to share my experience. Thanks for listening to my story. I know it's going to sound pretty cliche, but the truth is that this is something that has really stuck with me my whole life. Kind of traumatized me in a way. It's not like I got hurt or anything, but it always feels kind of scary to talk about, even now. This whole series of events took place when I was in high school, quite a few years ago now. I still remember it clear as day, though. You see, my family and I had lived in the same spot pretty much all of our lives, but my dad got a really good job opportunity down in Montana. We moved there, and it was an easy enough adjustment since I was kind of a shy kid anyway. I spent too much time with my internet friends to really care about the ones I had in school. But since I didn't know anybody, I didn't have much to do after classes, other than sit alone at home waiting for my parents to get home from work. The first few weeks were completely normal, nothing of note except for the occasional creaky floorboard or spooky-sounding draft. I was pretty comfortable outdoors since my family used to own a small farm. And at the time, we still had a couple of animals. I would take care of them from time to time when my parents weren't around, and I didn't mind too much either since I kind of liked the company. There was one day, though, when I came home from school to a downright massacre. My parents had told me that they weren't able to feed the chickens that we kept in the back before they both headed out for the day. So, just check up on them when you get home from school, they told me. And yes, I did check, but it was definitely too late. There was a mix of blood and feathers splattered and sprayed everywhere in the coop, unlike anything I'd ever seen before. The thing that really got me about that was the amount of gore, because in the past we've definitely had similar things happen where wild animals attack and sometimes get our chickens. But most of the time there would be some blood in the trail and the animal would drag the chicken away to eat it, or the animal would carry it away, or there would be a carcass with a small pool of blood. But instead, this time, the entirety of the left half of the coop was a bloodbath. I don't want to get too into the nitty-gritty, but I will tell you this, I haven't eaten chicken again. Seriously. Like I said, we were a farm family, so we treated our livestock very respectfully and very seriously. When this happened, my mother was very torn up about it, and my dad was downright pissed. He said that it would be his new personal mission to figure out whatever it was that did that to the chickens. And honestly, he kind of got obsessive over it. Then again, though, we didn't want to lose any more animals. He set up this pretty intricate security system meant to capture footage of anything the motion sensors detected. Plus, he put a special lock on the coop door. Very high-tech stuff. I had a pretty decent view of the back where the coop was through my bedroom window, so in the evenings I'd also take a peek or two out of curiosity. And that's how I got a good look at it, or him, one night. I was getting ready for bed and some gut instinct or feeling told me to go and look out the window. When I did, I noticed that the bushes behind the chicken coop were kind of rustling. I knew it was some kind of an animal, and I was interested. So I kept watching, and that's when I saw the beast. A monster. A creature I couldn't explain. This was no standard coyote or wolf or anything of the sort. It came out through the bushes and it stared at the coop from a distance. Now all of the cameras were pointed at the coop, so none of this was actually caught on video. Likely story, I know, but this did happen. And then this wolf thing, this monster, it was so bizarre. It had the head of a dog, clear as day, but its torso and general upper body were so disgustingly human-like. It was covered in hair top to toe. But the weirdest part was that the eyes on the head were also incredibly human. It was like a really messed up version of a Twilight werewolf or something. So this was it, the bit that really scared me, the bit that convinced me that this thing wasn't just a wild animal. The thing began approaching the coop, clearly with intent, and then it stopped. It stopped just a few feet short of the general area, and then it was looking up at the cameras. This thing genuinely recognized that it would be captured on video and stopped right in its tracks, like it understood. And then as it began to back away, it stood up on its hind legs. At this particular point, I took only a second's glance before fearfully turning away and ducking down where I knew it couldn't see me. I thankfully held my breath, so I didn't scream or anything. Lord knows I could have. When I watched this monster standing on its two back legs, it had stood up to a height that nearly topped the trees in the yard. Definitely 7, maybe 8 feet, which again, not a characteristic of any animal that I know of. And it looked eerie, so foreign. I only looked for a second, but as I said, I know I'm not mistaken. I'm convinced this thing is real. This was some kind of an encounter because our chickens were left alone from then on, completely. Even though I've been looking behind my shoulder ever since, and out the window every night, I've never seen that creature again. Not anywhere. And you know what? Interesting or otherwise, I hope I never do. When I was a teenager, we lived in a very small town in Idaho. It wasn't very far from Mountain Home Air Force Base. We lived on the south side of town, and there was some BLM land across the street from our house, and a landfill not far away, just up the road. My siblings and I spent a lot of time running around the hills in the area. One thing is that there were a lot of sheep herders in the hills to the south, and we liked to follow them around. One night, my mom was just coming home from grocery shopping, and I heard her call to me inside from the driveway. But the tone of her voice sounded weird to me. I was the oldest, and my brother and sister were already in bed, so I wondered what she needed. I could tell that she was concerned about something bigger than just her trying to get me to come and bring in the groceries. My first thought was that she had spotted a coyote nearby because they had been plaguing us lately. I went outside running, and she pointed to something that was just hovering south and east of us, out over the landfill. She was like, "Can you tell what the heck that is?" I was familiar with most types of aircraft. I'd been attending every air show I could with my grandfather since I was a toddler, and my dad worked in aerospace as a machinist. The thing she was pointing at made a noise, like a loud but distant vacuum cleaner. For example, this was not the kind of noise you would expect to hear out of a helicopter hovering at that range. I'd seen plenty of helicopters, and it definitely was not that. And we grew up around airplanes, both civilian and military. This thing was not moving, and it appeared to be about the size of a school bus. It was hard to say exactly what shape it was, but I'm pretty sure it was triangular, and it was giving off this strange glow. The light was like a muted green, and it was pulsating in waves. It kind of looked like when the surface of a pond is disturbed by a stone. It was just hovering there, and it seemed to be casting that glow down onto something below it. After we stood out there for a few minutes, it then started to move, really slowly. And then the noise got a little louder, but not what you would expect from something that large that was hovering and moving slowly. The thing traced the line of the road, north, near our home, and then we lost sight of it as it passed the little hill at the end of our road. We walked around the east side of the house to try and pick it up visually as it passed the end of our row of houses. And then we saw it follow the road, about 50 to 60 feet above the ground. It still wasn't making a lot of noise, but then literally, in the blink of an eye, the light went from down the road in front of us to hovering over the lights across the valley that were illuminating the ski runs way off in the distance. A map will tell you that this was a little over 35 miles away. The crazy thing is that at that point, there was no noise. It was just silent, yet instant acceleration. The thing moved 30-something miles in a fraction of a second. We tracked it the whole time, not believing what we were seeing. It then hovered over the ski area for about half a second, and then it shot straight up at about the same speed with which it crossed the valley. Then we lost sight of it in the star field as it went straight up from the mountain. The stars are always bright at night in that section of Idaho. I remember watching as it went up. It lost that glow and then turned to a vivid green that got brighter and brighter. It kind of resembled a firework that didn't blow up, but it went much faster and much higher. The next morning on the bus, I told the kids from the end of the row of houses about what my mom and I had seen. They made fun of me, and it made me the butt of jokes for over the next day or so. Also, I was kind of a strange, nerdy kid and pretty much a social outcast. The subject did not come up again until maybe a year later when I guess I got a little cooler and I ended up being friends with one of those kids from the bus. He ended up confessing to me that he, his brother, and mom and dad had all seen the same thing that we had, but he had been too embarrassed to admit it in front of everybody on the bus after the way they all acted towards me. And his parents had also told him not to talk to anybody about it, because people would say they were crazy. To give you an idea of the timeline, this was the early 2000s. And ever since then, I've since pursued a career as an intelligence analyst, and I've been granted privileged access to confidential data concerning aircraft and other military equipment from all developed nations. As an imagery analyst in the U.S. Army intelligence, my primary focus was on ground, sea, and air order of battle. I had to know as much about enemy and friendly hardware as possible. I had to file accurate reports for command and to understand what it was that I was looking at. I'm telling you this for a reason. Nothing moves the way that thing moved. Nothing we have, nothing anyone has. There will be some who choose to believe me, and there will be others who won't. But I'm confident in what I saw. But at the same time, I don't anticipate ever getting a satisfactory explanation for what happened. In 2015, I was exploring by myself at a place called High Gorge Falls in the Adirondacks. It's a pretty popular place in the summer, but I went in early December to see the ice forming on the falls. I found that to be more interesting, and the stillness of the place made exploring and photographing things easier. There were only a few people there throughout the day, and I was never in one place with them for too long. It was one of those chilly days that seemed dark even with the sun shining. My aim was to head back through the forest to the picnic area by 3 o'clock to make sure I got some food in before the long drive back to the Hudson Valley. I reached the edge of the forest, ready to hike through, when I couldn't help but notice an overwhelming sense of dread. Chills crept up my spine. I felt like something was staring back at me from the forest. I pulled out my map to frantically find another way, but then thought to myself how silly I sounded. How could something be watching me? I told myself to just suck it up and continued through the forest. It would be faster than taking some nature trail all around. I tried to keep my eyes on the ground to just avoid any low-hanging branches and to keep my balance. I was about halfway through when I heard something snap to my right. Immediately I stopped and looked around but saw nothing. I started to move when I heard it again, this time to my left. I looked around again and saw nothing. Then I heard it to my right again, and then my left, and so on until the noise became faster. I noticed on my final turn that a small tree was swaying in the wind. I was thinking, good, now I have a natural cause to explain away these sounds. But then I heard it somewhere else, and a bush on the opposite side began shaking. I thought that it was more wind until a shadow began to rise behind that bush. I never imagined there was anything to the sound. I was scared to death. I froze. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. It had to be a creature of some kind, hunched over but still at least 7 feet tall, with dark, matted hair. Bits of skin were sticking out of the fur, and it looked pale as a corpse underneath. It had a thin frame, too, almost like it was malnourished or it had been out very long. Its head was large and pointed. It had no hair on its face, only around its neck. I couldn't tell if it was male or female. The creature had these large, reddish eyes glowing down on me, but I'm not sure if it was looking through me or at me. It seemed to be looking at something else, actually. I'm not sure how long I stood there, but when I snapped back to reality, I ran as fast as I could through the forest, which was actually quite small. My escape felt never-ending. I heard the branches of trees snap and the sound of something running behind me the entire time. I didn't look back. I didn't want to see it again or fall and be at its mercy. I made it to the picnic area and sat down on a bench. There was no one else there. Even the concessions closed because the afternoon was growing cold. My heart was racing. I looked around, but it seemed like whatever it was disappeared into thin air, even though I had heard it before reaching the clearing. I sat there for a few minutes trying to catch my breath. I didn't want to go back through that forest ever again, or even to see the falls because I know the area around them was too woody. I just kept my eyes on the trees, expecting that thing to come out again, but there was nothing. I have no reason to believe it was a Sasquatch, but I've never seen anything like it. I've never been so scared in my life. I still don't know what it was, but I decided to start looking into Sasquatch after that. I've seen other supposed sightings in the Adirondacks, and I know I saw something. I just may never know exactly what its purpose was, or what it was. The next story comes to us from Michigan, from 2 high school seniors who were camping near Bluff Lake in 2007. I was camping with a friend at a campground near Bluff Lake near our hometown of Clare, Michigan in about 2007. We were in our senior year of high school at the time, and it was a close-by campsite that we could celebrate our graduation together at. The moon was full that night, and the sky was clear, normal for a June evening. We had just gotten into our sleeping bags and were talking when I noticed the trees were very, very still, like they weren't moving or rustling at all. It was so quiet that I could hear my veins pump blood and my stomach growl even though I had just eaten dinner. I told my friend that I felt something was going to happen and it was going to be big. I didn't know what, but I had very good intuition, so I was totally on high alert. And sure enough, that's when I heard it. An incredibly low, odd growl. It was so deep that it shook the ground. I actually felt it more than I heard it. It was coming from the woods to the left of us, about 25 feet away. I told my friend to be quiet because she was shaking and wouldn't stop sobbing and asking me what was going on. I told her to get her flashlight and get into her sleeping bag. If it approached and looked like it was going to hurt us, I told her to shine it right in his eyes and make a lot of noise. She did as I said, trying not to make any more noise. I could see something moving in the moonlight through the trees. It was huge. I had no frame of reference to compare it to, but it was bigger than a bear. And then it came into the clearing and it stopped. It was so tall that I couldn't see its head through low-hanging branches, but I didn't need to see its head. I could feel its eyes on me. They were like laser beams. I could feel them moving towards me. And then its scrunched up humanoid face came out into the clearing of our campsite and it stared down at me. It was sniffing and moving around, but never taking its eyes off of me. I watched as it was coming closer. I thought for sure it was going to kill us. The smell was horrible too. It smelled like rotten meat. It got closer still, its hot breath on me. I thought I was going to pass out. I could feel my heart beating in my ears. Literally, Bigfoot was standing over me as my friend quietly sobbed and shook in the sleeping bag behind me. And that's when the creature stopped suddenly and turned its attention to my backpack. It began sniffing it and pulling at the straps, trying to open it. I could feel it. It was trying to go through my stuff. I watched as it opened the bag, and instead of taking anything from it, the creature just opened it wider with 2 long fingers and peered inside. It sniffed around then, as if it was trying to make sure there was no food in there. And then as suddenly as it appeared, it began walking away. My friend was sobbing louder now as it disappeared into the trees, and I was able to take a deep breath finally after holding it for the entire encounter. I'll never forget that night, but no one ever believed my friend or myself. Sometimes when I return on camping trips, I leave out some scraps from dinner, hoping that it's nearby, and it will come to get something to eat and I can see it again. Our third story comes in from a young woman who was only 8 at the time of her encounter. I was about 8 years old when I saw something that absolutely changed my life. It was winter of 2002, and I was with my parents and my younger brother on a family vacation to a cabin in the woods. And we were all staying inside the cabin because it was cold outside. The cabin had one large room with a wood-burning stove in the middle and a small kitchen area off to the side that had a table and chairs. There were 2 doors, one on each side of the cabin. One door led to the porch and the other to the yard. My parents and brother were inside the cabin all bundled up, so I decided to volunteer to run out and grab a few pieces of firewood from my dad. I liked to be the adventurous type, whereas my brother liked to stay close to my mom. It was later at night, so it also made me feel older and more trusted to be the one outside gathering the firewood. I even stopped in front of the wood pile to gaze up at the stars, taking my time before I had to go back in and huddle up with everybody else. I wasn't feeling very scared because I knew my parents and brother were inside. I actually wasn't afraid of much at that age. But suddenly I saw the shadow of a large figure walk across the front of the cabin's property, which was lined with underbrush, and that caused the fear to really well up. The creature continued around the back of the cabin and out of my sight, but I could hear its gigantic footprints crunching through the snow. I was afraid to move or breathe. I could tell it was trying to not make more noise than necessary as it crept around, which made me worried about my family inside. They had no idea what might be watching them. The thought of that creeped me out even as a kid, and I felt an obligation to run in and warn them. I knew I couldn't be there to see the creature come back around. That would have been a really bad idea, so I decided to run back inside the house. I threw the wood into the air and turned to run, but I crashed right into the rotten-smelling fur filled with twigs and burrs. I looked up at what had to be a giant, and then down to its feet that were hairy and enormous. I looked up again and made eye contact with its small, beady black eyes. It looked at me for a few seconds, making a small groaning noise, and then it turned and walked away without even laying a finger on me, almost like it was just checking in. I was very confused and scared as to why it didn't try to hurt me or where it had come from, where it was going. I ran into the cabin and told my parents and brother what I had seen, but my parents told me it was probably a deer or somebody's dog, and they told me just to calm down. My dad even got upset when he realized that I hadn't brought back any wood. However, I knew what I saw was not a deer or a dog. It was tall, it had long hair all over its body, and it walked on 2 legs. I saw it clearly. It was not dark, it wasn't cloudy outside. I never forgot that day, and over the years I've tried to find out what it was, what I saw. We always went back to the cabin every summer with my grandparents or during the fall with our dad to learn scouting, but I would always look for signs of that Bigfoot. It's the only reason I ever wanted to go back there again in the first place, but I never did see it again. Next up is an encounter sent in from a husband and wife who were camping in their RV to celebrate their wedding anniversary. I was awakened by a very loud and unusual noise that was unlike anything I've ever heard before. It was a long, loud, and very deep roar that lasted for about a minute or so. It was very deep, guttural, very loud. I could feel the vibration of the sound through our RV, and we had parked in the Snake River RV Park in Idaho Falls. It was our wedding anniversary, June 12th of 2019. My husband was sleeping and didn't hear it himself, though I don't understand how anyone could sleep through it. When it happened a second time, I became so frightened it was time to wake him up. He didn't hear it that time either, and he wiped his eyes awake as he tried to be there for me. He offered to go out on the porch to see if he could hear anything, but I talked him out of it. I could hear dogs in the park start barking, and they were frantic. I could hear the few neighboring RVs awaken with sounds of people mumbling and wondering where the sound was coming from. I grabbed on my husband's arm as the roar sounded a third time. This time he heard it, and so did everyone else in the park. There were only about 10 of us scattered throughout the area, but people already began taking off and leaving us, and maybe one other camper parked there. Slowly we came to be alone, and whatever was making that noise was there too. My husband was a brave man, and against my wishes, he decided he could go outside and walk around the RV to see if he could see anything or hear anything. Through the window, he shouted to me that it was silent out there. Any remaining RVs must have stayed hidden with their lights off. Also, it had been raining earlier in the evening, but the night sky was clear, and there was a good portion of the moon shining over us. In the light of the moon, with the drops of water glistening, he could see no disturbance and hear no other noises. So he came back inside. We turned out our lights and hid under a blanket, Googling what could have made that sound. I Googled lion sounds and listened to several distinct kinds of roars, including a mountain lion recorded in California. I tried to keep my phone at a low volume while exploring these ideas, but after the last recording, the roar from outside happened again, and this time it was as if it was right in front of our RV. And then the RV began to shake. My husband's eyes grew wide. Whatever it was climbing onto our RV. My husband bolted outside again, this time with a bat, to see what was climbing on our vehicle. The hair stood up on his neck as he realized what was out there. And he didn't stay long. He came right back inside, shaking his head no, telling me it couldn't be, but with no other explanation. As the RV shook, I kept begging him to give me a name or something, but he was in such shock. He pulled me into the small bathroom of the RV and shut the door. A few minutes later, we felt the shaking go more violent, as if the creature were right above us. The tiny bathroom skylight was blacked out by giant tufts of fur. We held each other and shut our eyes until the shaking stopped. After a few minutes, there was silence. My husband slowly led us out of the bathroom and headed to the door. He snuck out to investigate and saw that our RV had massive foot dents in it. We left incredibly early after that, before sunrise. Neither of us felt safe there anymore, with whatever remained out there lurking near our RV. I never understood why he chose our RV, or if he had tried to explore someone else's that night. All I knew was that he was not afraid to get close to us, which was terrifying. From then on, we picked a different RV park for every future trip. Our final story comes to us from an Instagram influencer who got the surprise of their life in the summer of 2015. I was an Instagram influencer when it first became popular. By 2015, I had a ton of followers who loved my true crime stories. I decided to kick it up a notch once with some stories about mythical creatures and cryptozoology. I wanted to gain more of a presence and maybe even see myself get more sponsors on my channel. I planned out a trip to Big Bend National Park in my home state of Texas and rented out a campsite in early 2015 with a friend. Our plan was to catch Bigfoot on film. We had a costume for my friend to wear and cameras were ready. All we had to do was wait for night. That night, I noticed a young couple setting up their tent about 30 yards away from us. We had no intention of scaring them, but if we captured something on film where someone was actually scared, people would probably believe the video more. The night went by without much of anything happening. The couple eventually fell asleep in their tent, and we were about to head over, my friend in full Sasquatch gear, when something caught my eye. I heard what sounded like branches snapping in the distance as we exited our tent. My friend pulled the furry mask off and asked me if we should be worried about mountain lions. I told her no, that they wouldn't come near people unless provoked. And then the snapping was followed by a guttural moan that made my hair on my arms stand up. My friend and I looked at each other with wide eyes. I fumbled around for my phone to turn the camera on as my friend huddled behind me in the tent, refusing to put the mask back on. I started recording and tried to coax her out in the costume to see if she would attract anything. The noise happened again, and instead she dove inside the tent. I was too curious and hungry for popularity to care. I started filming the bushes in front of our campsite, hoping that they would start moving again. Sure enough, they did, swaying back and forth as if something big was stuck in their tiny prickly branches. I narrated what was happening on the video, half expecting to disappoint fans when a lion or coyote walked out of the bushes. But instead, a giant shadow suddenly pulled itself free of the bushes and headed in my direction. In the moonlight, there was no mistaking it. It had long brown fur, covered in twigs and filth. The smell was something I had never smelled before, pungent, rotting, like roadkill that had been left out in the sun. The creature noticed me and continued towards me. It was massive, towering high above my 5'3" stature. I couldn't take my eyes off of its massive long arms with claw-like hands at the end of them. Its mouth was open in a snarl that revealed sharp teeth. It let out another moan, and I dropped the phone to run for it, hoping it would chase me instead of my friend who was still hiding in the tent. I ran straight for the couple's tent, screaming for help, for both me and my friend. The boyfriend stepped out to take a look over towards our tent, but by the time he looked, the creature was gone. The couple offered to walk me back to my tent, check on my friend, who luckily was safe and sound. Laying on the ground, though, in the middle of a giant footprint, with fur stuck to it, was my phone cracked into pieces. All the footage I had just taken was gone.